All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our first Ask Allie Anything. I say first because I am so excited about this. I know it's going to be really informative. I know I'm going to learn a lot. We have so many questions that came in, and therefore I hope we can do this, a few more times. It'd be so exciting to have you back. But yeah, thank everybody for coming to our first Ask Allie Anything. I see the numbers ticking up. Allie, I just sent out like a final reminder email. It's like that email that says like, click right here, let's get in. So usually people are opening in that and coming in right now. So love to see it climbing.
Yeah.
But yeah, let me just Allie knows this about me. I am a big proponent of starting promptly. So you know what? Because everyone's going to get the recording either
Yep.
way. I'm just going to hop right in. All right.
Do it.
Okay. So, like I said, this is our first Ask Allie Anything. Yes, it looks like Randy actually read maybe what my next sentence was going to be, which was, please let me know where you're calling in from. And actually, I also would love to know what nonprofits are you here representing? Because my favorite thing to think about while I'm in these webinar settings is to think about the overall impact that we're all making together. So please drop where you're calling in from, drop the nonprofit you're representing. Like I mentioned, I personally sorted through all of your questions. There were over 100 great questions that were submitted during registration, and I think I picked out some really good ones that kind of span a lot of missions and really a lot of different issues that nonprofits face. So I'm excited to ask you them. But before we get started, I do have a very shameless plug. I'm going to be completely honest with that. I have a shameless plug. If you are here, I bet that means that you believe in ethical storytelling. And right now, I'm running a survey where I'm trying to get as much information as I can about the current state of ethical storytelling for nonprofits. So if anybody here has not taken my survey yet, here is the link to take a 10-question survey about ethical storytelling. It's so simple. I would really, truly, I would take it as a personal favor to me that you take the survey. So I'm going to drop this link right now. Here is the link.
And
Thank you.
I'll echo that because the resources you guys at MemoryFox put out with like what you gathered from these are amazing.
Yes,
So to know
they
what
include
the
in all our resources, we'll be using it to write our next year's ethical storytelling report, but also all of our articles that we write, every other resource, like the webinars, the panels we put together, they're informed by this survey. So thank you so much, everyone. If you've taken it already, if you haven't, I'd love for you to do that. Okay, shameless plug over, back to our event. A couple logistics. This is being recorded, so you'll all receive a copy via email from me after the event, so be on the lookout for that. If you have any questions for Allie, do drop them in the chat or in the Q&A section. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look through them, and if it's not something that we plan to cover, I'll save that to the end for us to cover. But I imagine that a lot of people will probably ask questions that we probably already have on the docket. And then finally, if anybody wants to learn about MemoryFox specifically, I'll be doing just a short demo at the very end of the hour. So I encourage everyone to stay on for a couple extra minutes if you're interested to learn about MemoryFox. Okay, I think I did all of my intros so quick, 4 minutes, right? Okay, so now what you've all been waiting for, I would love to introduce our very special guest today. Her name is Allie Levene. She is an attorney and the founder of Levene Legal. At Levene Legal, they specialize in providing affordable and accessible legal services to small businesses and nonprofits. Before founding Levene Legal, Allie served as in-house and outside counsel for a number of Connecticut businesses. And in those roles, she represented clients in litigation and administrative proceedings related to employment, civil rights, and general liability. Allie was also a panelist on our most recent Narratives with Integrity panel. It happened in September. That's why she's here, because we had so many questions that were so unique to things that Allie knows about that we said, let's do this again. Let's invite her back. So it really is an honor to have you back. We have a legal professional here today to answer your nonprofit legal questions. Welcome, Allie.
Thank you for having me back. I'm so excited.
I have been looking forward to this for so long. So, okay, without further ado, let's hop in.
Let's do it.
Okay, so our first question, this is going to be a question that kind of will just set the stage for the event today. So I just want to first off ask, how do you know what laws and requirements apply to your nonprofit?
Such a good question and such a good way to kick it off because it really frames everything we're going to talk about. I mean it when I say no nonprofit is the same. Even if you do similar work, there are so many things that make you different. And one of those things is the laws and requirements that apply to your nonprofit. One of the most important things and ways to determine what those requirements are is simply what state you're in. A lot of the rules governing nonprofits are done at the state level and not as much as the federal level. So you really got to look at your state that you're operating in. And if you're an organization that operates in multiple states, you've got to look at requirements for each of those states. And the other piece is in the storytelling context, you have to consider if the person who's giving you the storyteller, if they're in another state, you've got to look at that state's requirements. So the other piece is contracts, grants, accreditation standards, right? Where is your funding coming from? That may have certain requirements attached to it based on what you're doing. One example, I've seen a state-funded program that said consent forms have to be renewed every year. So there's going to be specifics based on that. So all of that to say that the law, consent, what we're talking about, it's not one size fits all. So what we're going to do today is we're going to give you general guidance, best practices, pointers, but it's really important to look at what applies to your specific organization.
Wow, I have actually never heard anyone mention before that where your storyteller is located that could impact the type of consent or certain things about consent. Wow, that's really interesting. I'm really glad you brought that up.
And I just see someone put in the chat that they do internationally. And so that's another point, right? If you're serving an international community, you've got to look at those laws as well. So it is so highly dependent on what you do and where you do it.
So, okay, so actually my next question here actually really serves this what you're saying very well, because this next question actually was something I'm personally interested in knowing. And I want to know, so what are the risks associated with not collecting storytelling consent? Because you're saying you might have to check international laws, you might have to check state laws. So, okay, what if I don't? What risk am I, maybe liable for?
Yeah. So risk is inherent in everything, even ethical storytelling, right? And in a sense, it's probably more so because you want to be more ethical. And so I think let's first, what is risk? Because risk and risk management can be this scary process, especially for nonprofits, because it's most often looked at financial services, things like that. When we talk about risk, we're asking what could go wrong? So you want to ask yourself, knowing your storytelling process, what could go wrong in our process? So the biggest one is that you don't actually have informed consent to share that story. So what happens then? Maybe the person they sues, they could be re-traumatized by the way that story was shared, right? That maybe they were okay with you sharing it internally, but they didn't actually consent to you sharing it out in the world because what they were talking about was very traumatic, and now you've gone through that. And that in turn, all of this, the reputation of your organization. So there's a lot of risks associated with storytelling, but that means making it part of your risk management process. It
Right.
doesn't have to be scary. It's simply identify your risks, assess them, and then mitigate them. And the way that you mitigate them, and I think we're going to talk about this probably more, is with written consents.
Yeah.
But the first step is identifying them. And so those are some of the big ones that I think are out there.
So I think, yeah, this is such a good point. One thing that has me thinking about is maybe, okay, who do you think should like be in charge of doing this process? Like, and how do we let everyone on staff know and get on the same page?
Yeah. So it's going to be dependent based on the size of your organization. Let's say maybe you're an all volunteer run organization, right? Let's start with there. So you don't have a compliance officer, you don't have a CFO, but you still want to have somebody overall that's in charge of your risk management process. And then you kind of branch it off and you say, okay, our marketing risk, who's going to kind of own that? But then we report back to the board. So it's You have somebody overall who's making sure that everyone is doing their pieces, but based on what roles each person plays in your organization, they take ownership because they know that process best, but it also has to fit in practically. It has to be workable for you, but also the solutions you come up with to manage that risk have to be workable. And who knows that? The people that are actually on the ground doing your work. So
Right.
the number one thing I'll say is when we talk about getting input, when you're doing this, say you are an organization that has a C-suite. It shouldn't just be the C-suite. You need to be talking to the people. So who are the people actually collecting the consents? Who are the people gathering the stories, working, out in the community? You've got to talk to those people, find out about the process, so that you can identify where there may be some, risks.
Yeah. And that could even be, like you said, your volunteers. Maybe you have events where volunteers are speaking to people, or you've tasked a volunteer with collecting photos or videos. Maybe before you task that volunteer, you just have a little meeting with them, or you send them an outline of what your consent looks like and why, how you got there.
That is so important, the why. Because if the people who are getting the consent understand why it's so important, they're more likely to do it. So one
Right.
of the biggest flaws I see, and this is for-profits, nonprofits, is we have our policies and procedures, but we don't explain the why. And so they can sometimes seem burdensome, and then the people who actually have to follow them aren't following them. But if they understand that we're not doing this just to make your life harder, we're doing this to protect the organization, we're doing this to protect the people's stories we're sharing, because at the end of the day, all of those risks, it could hurt your mission. And we're all here for the mission, and you don't want to jeopardize the mission. So if they understand how that fits into that puzzle, they're more likely to make sure they get the proper consent.
I wonder, have you ever heard somebody say, okay, we wrote these risks down, but what are the chances that's going to happen to me?
So I have a few phrases that I feel like I hear a lot, and one of them is, but it hasn't happened yet. And this is where it's like, what is your risk tolerance then as an organization? And it also might depend. How big is that risk? If it's a risk that could sink the organization, then you shouldn't be taking that risk because the outcome is too much. If it's only, oh, we might just have like something smaller, right? Bad publicity, but it's a tiny thing. We don't care about that. That's all part of the risk management process and assessing how big is that risk? What is it really? And what is a cost-effective but also practical way to address it? And it's going to look different for every organization because you may be in a more highly regulated, industry. You may be working, maybe with adults with developmental disabilities. And so you have stricter requirements. You've got to really do a lot more to make sure informed consent versus you run a food bank and you want to get consent from the volunteer storytellers, right? So no situation is the same. And that's all part of the risk management assessment.
Interesting. Oh, that's so fascinating.
And I will do a shameless plug about I did an article about if people have more questions on risk management and nonprofits, walking you through a little bit more, because it can be a really scary and confusing process.
Yeah. I'll tee up your next question, but I have that article on hand, so I'll drop.
Awesome.
But yes, okay, so this is another kind of maybe like a high level overview of like consent, but this question actually came from our September panel, and we did get a chance to answer it, but not super in depth. So the question was, what should or must be included on a storytelling consent form?
And this is probably the question that everybody's like on the edge of their seats, like what's going to be in there? So the number one thing that needs to be in there is the actual consent language. What does that mean? There's two things to have informed consent. Now, what is informed consent, right? That means the person needs to actually understand and appreciate what they're agreeing to. And so when we're talking about consent of somebody's story, photo, video, anything of them that's going out into the public, they need to consent to. The first thing is what is being shared. And you got to be as specific as possible. Are you sharing their photo? Are you sharing a video? Are you sharing their story? So that's the first thing you got to set out. The second is, how is that story being shared? It's a lot different if I agree to give you my picture for your annual report versus putting it on a billboard on the side of the highway. Just because I consent to use of my picture for the annual report, it's much different. And what I see most often is these broad consents we can use for anything and everything. And this is where the difference between legal and ethical really comes in.
Right.
Maybe that's legal, but this is how the difference between legal and ethical can be broken down, or how I break it down. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. So if you would not feel comfortable, or you don't, right, like that ethicalness inside of you says this doesn't feel right, and it doesn't, right? Like if this person consented, they didn't really know I was going to put it on a billboard. How could they know from this broad language what I was going to do? They could end up on a commercial. Like these things have really big implications, especially in the age of social media. So you have to be specific about how you're sharing it. So that's the consent language. Then the rest really comes down to what risks are you going to address? And this is where you're deciding in your process, because you want the form to be as short and readable as possible. That is how you're most likely to guarantee it gets read and understood. You want to make sure that it's written in a way that the population or the person you're giving it to can understand it. So you also want to protect the organization. So some risks involved are, is the person going to later say, hey, I want payment for that? Maybe. So you should have some sort of provision that says whether or not there's compensation for that. Another important one is intellectual property, right? The stuff that you are making, that content, that is intellectual property. Who owns that? The organization, most usually, right? Because you don't want that person to be able to then go share it in a different context or way that you did not intend, or that, right? So something outlining who owns that and has the right to use it. Another one that goes along with that, review. Does the individual have the right to review the content before you put it out there? That's a big one. And the other big one is release language that releases the organization from liability for use of this. And that really comes in is once it's out of your hands, right? Like say you're putting on social media, you can't control what happens then. So let's say they get upset and they're like, I didn't realize, and now this is affecting my job or things like that. Oh my goodness, we are so sorry. But that's why that language in there is really important, because ethical storytelling requires you to protect not just the storyteller, but your organization. It's a two-way street.
That's such a good point. And yeah, sometimes people will want, like you were saying, maybe a billboard, for example. That's maybe something people just might not be comfortable with. I certainly don't think I'd want to drive by and see my face up on a billboard, probably for anything. But so that's really interesting. So let's say that is the example, right? So let's say you were asking me for a story and you had told me in the consent form, this could be used on social media channels, and maybe you list those out. If you did want to use my story again for like a billboard or for maybe a print material, so are you recommending that you get another consent, a differently written consent form for that?
Yes, but what I will say, and I think we're going to touch on this later, is you can very much template your consents. So you can have like boxes, and so now just this next time, or you can have, where only that language or is going to be changed. So it's still the same form, but you're just going to get it for this specific purpose. So that's right. Think of it in terms of what is the purpose. If you're using it now for a new purpose and it's not covered by that, get another consent.
Got it. So then in that way, that's how you kind of make sure that it is informed consent, because you're checking back in and you're saying, you know what, we're actually planning, we would love to use your story in this new way. And we would love it if you could opt in this way. And here's how we're planning to do it. And here's maybe a timeline.
And I think too is, even though, yes, this is a legal document, it can still be like consent forms that I typically create. They're a page. They're less than a page. You can still do this in a short, concise way that doesn't, because you also don't want to scare people off. And a lot of times legalese type things can do that. So I promise you can still do it in a way that makes it so it's easy for you, and they're not kind of like, oh, they're having me sign this and this again, and oh my gosh, all this stuff. A volunteer. It can be done.
Right. That is a good point. You don't want to evoke fear in people either, of course. And that could be a delicate thing that you might have to deal with. So yeah, thanks for touching on that as well. You did mention So the next question, you were completely right. I was going to follow up and say that Anne, she submitted a question and she said, are there any consent form templates available for customization? So you think that there is kind of room for customization.
100%. And I think, there are certainly online templates available. I just always like to give the caveat, online templates don't know your specific requirements, right? So even if you choose to use an online template and customize it, I highly recommend working with an attorney at least to review that, make sure it meets any of your contract grant requirements, make sure that the language, it actually is doing what it says. Because a lot of times these templates, they don't take into account the variation in state law or things like that. So it's still important to have legal counsel review your forms.
Okay. I think that's a great point. Yeah.
And I don't say that just because I'm an attorney, I promise.
I know that's not why you're saying that. No, that's why we have you here today, because we got to get the real answers. So that's important. Okay. I see that there are a couple questions in the chat that I actually think we're going to answer with my next question here, which is about anonymity. So this question, it's a little bit long, so stay with me, but this question was submitted by Ashley. So she said, when we change a story to protect anonymity, do we still need to get consent from the person? For example, we use false names. We change the specifics of the incident in question. We change the gender or maybe the demographic of the people. For example, just to make sure that it's not identifiable in any way, but we keep the spirit of the story. So yeah, do I still need to get consent from that person?
So I'm going to do the legal answer first and then the ethical, because they're different in this case, I think. So legally, you need consent if what you're sharing in any way can identify that person. Well, that's a really blurry line. There is no exact answer because maybe you removed enough information where Allie, out in the public can't, but so-and-so's family, oh my gosh, there's enough in there that somebody could do that. So the ethical answer is always get consent, right? Because do you really want to run that risk? But also, at the end of the day, it's still that person's story.
Right.
So ethically, you should be getting consent every time. And because legally, there is no remove this much and you're good, leave this much bad. It's a very blurry line.
Ooh, that is such a good point. We get this question all the time from our MemoryFox storytellers. Yeah, like how many things should I change or how many things make it anonymous? But I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head, which is a story ever truly fully anonymous?
And if it really is truly anonymous, it almost, I feel like, might lose, right, the impact. Because
Right.
I'm sure a lot of the people on right now are thinking the more they strip away, it does tend to lose its impact. So to have the most impact and achieve its purpose, you got to retain some bit of, identification or story.
Absolutely. I also think that sometimes we work with missions that will say, like they're going through this process, right? And then they say, well, how about what if I do a composite story? So I take a little bit from several stories and I put it together. Are there certain risks associated with that, or how would you feel about that?
I mean, I think it's still the same thing. If you're still using that person's story. Now, I think where the line, where I'd say you're more okay, is sometimes we have where multiple people have a very similar story,
Yeah.
right? And that's when you make it anonymous. So now it's not obvious who it is because it can apply to so many people. I think from an ethical and legal perspective, that is where you would be okay because you're sharing that almost commonality, that theme. It doesn't really belong to one person.
Ooh, that's a very good point. Like if this many people receive the same exact service, then in that way, it's almost like it's so not, it's specific, but it's so unspecific that therefore it is anonymous.
Right. Nobody could go and be like, oh, I know that you were one of those people, or right. Like it's enough of a group and it's enough identifying information nobody can identify. And that's what you got to really ask yourself is, would anybody be able to identify this person? Right.
Right. But I think you are exactly right in that it never hurts to see if it's okay to share their story.
And I think Because I think about if I was sharing my story, especially a lot of the stories that are being collected, they can be traumatic or they can be very personal. And I have plenty of stories like that of my own. And I think of it, how would I want to be treated? And I would want consent
Mhm.
to be obtained. I would want to have the ability to know how my story was being shared. So that's how I come at it. And that's how I come at everything I kind of do as a lawyer.
Absolutely. I love that. I think that's always a good like golden rule when it comes to storytelling. So that's really great. All right, let's move on to a slightly different topic and one that we actually didn't get a chance to address at our September panel, but we did have a lot of people that asked about this. So this is kind of a combo question. So what should I do? This was submitted by Karen, I should say. Karen submitted this back in September. She said, what should I do if my storyteller has passed away? Can I still use their story?
And this is such a good question. It's one that I remember I said to you, we got to get this on here because I saw it come in at the end of the chat of our last one, and it is such a good one. It's applicable to so many organizations. So the first thing is going to depend what the consent they signed says. If the consent indicates that they've irrevocably given their story, their picture, whatever it is, then unless there was some sort of, duress that you forced them or something like that, then that means their story can be used even after they pass away. And if it doesn't, then it's kind of So if you're not sure, you should reach out to the family and get that consent again. Now, I will say with that, though, there are some risks because you have to make sure that the person you're dealing with actually has the ability to give that consent. So now we're talking about whole probate process. Did they have a will? Did they have an executor? Just because someone's an executor, an administrator, doesn't mean they automatically have that ability. Maybe the will said in there, no, these things you cannot do. So it's a risk then to take that on. And so you really need to consider, is this a story that is so important that we need to keep it out there? Or is that risk too high that now I'm going to have another family member coming at me saying, no, I was the one who had this right, or you're getting in the middle of a family disagreement about it. Is that really a place you want to be? Um, Again, and this is all part of, right, that risk process. How much risk do you want to take on? And it's going to depend on the story itself. It's going to depend on a lot of stuff. And so all that to say, what can you do now going forward, knowing that this issue might come up, is to have language in your consent that indicates it's irrevocable, that it's going to survive somebody passing away.
I think exact 100%. And I also think that it is important to take our mission um, into consideration when we're thinking about stories that might be about people who have passed away, right? So obviously there are nonprofits out there that help people who we know are terminal, that is part of their story, right? That is part of their work with the nonprofit. I mean, that sounds, sort of dark, but that is a part of several missions. On the flip side, there might be a nonprofit that somebody might have shared their story for that has absolutely nothing to do with the way that they passed away. And I think that's a really important thing that people should consider as well.
Right, like what you're doing. And I think too, the other part of it is you have to consider also the family, because now you're also not just talking about, it could have an effect on the family. So even it, right, like what they're consenting, is it something that they think is negative, right? Like when you involve more people, there's just more room for
So
issues.
that's interesting. So Lisa here, she wrote in the chat, she said, I would also consider that you could be outing someone by going to their family unless you know with certainty that their family is aware of their story. That is a very good point.
And that's a great point in general too, because we talk about, right, using it for the consent that you only have. So let's talk about that, right, when I said the annual report versus billboard. What if it is a domestic violence situation? And you then went and put that on that billboard, and that person's ex didn't know where they were. And now by doing that, they do. So you have all these things by using a story in a way that you didn't get consent for, you may be jeopardizing that person's safety, just well-being in that way.
Definitely. So similarly in that vein, we had a question that came in from Laura during registration. I think I'll read the question. I think maybe you mentioned, or I think you probably already covered this, but the question was, I work in the legacy team for a nonprofit organization, and we often gather estate stories. Is the executor able to give and take away consent at any time? Can a family member who is not the executor take away consent from using an estate story? Ooh, that's a question.
Such a good question. And so what I would recommend in this situation is if this, you're doing this a lot, you need to build into your system, one, a way to get verification that the person consenting actually has that authority. So whether that's, the probate certificate showing that, having part of the consent be a certification that they have this authority. So that way, if they really don't, it's on them and not you. You relied on what they said. So to have them attest, certify, I have the authority to grant this consent or not. As far as taking away, again, it's going to be whoever actually has the authority to give it based on, all the different things, the will, how things are handled. With that said, I think it's really important, and this is how you involve other family members, right? Like, so you kind of have to figure out, even if, somebody might be that one person, is the whole family involved, and having just those conversations. And this goes for all consents. It shouldn't just be handing a form. There should be conversations, answering questions, explaining things, making sure they really understand. So in the case of an estate, that may be talking with people who aren't the decision maker, but are still involved, right? That's part of the ethical piece of it, I think.
Yeah.
But it's a very, I won't say hairy situation when you're dealing with who can actually consent and after somebody's died. But if it's part of what you do on a typical basis, you've got to build some sort of protection into your practices.
That's a really good point because, like Laura, the submitter of the question said, this is kind of something she's used to doing. So, or she has to do fairly often. So yeah, that's a really good point. Like this is an example of a procedure that you can put in place that you can get everyone on board with, that you can educate your volunteers, your board members, your staff, everybody about what the procedure is and what kind of things have maybe, even if they look different than they did in the past, but things maybe you're going to implement moving on.
Right. And also, I think in that case, especially, is when you need to involve legal counsel, because there may be situations where, you've got your policy, you say, hey, send over a copy of, the probate court certifying that you are the executor, and you're just not sure. Okay, consult with counsel to make sure that this person actually has that consent. And I think even working with counsel to establish what your procedures, like what documentation can you get from the estate that can ensure they have the ability to do this. And that's going to look different in each state. So that's why I think working with counsel to even establish those procedures is really important.
I love that. I think that's such great advice. Okay, let's shift gears a little bit. And this is something again that came up a lot during the September panel. We got to talk about it a little bit, but I love to go deeper. This question comes from Carla, and she said, how should storytelling consent forms for youth differ from those for adults?
Yes, so I think this was a hot topic in our first one, and still a lot of lingering questions, and it's so prevalent. So the first thing is deciding, can a youth actually sign? And that's going to vary by state, right? Different states may have different laws about when and how a youth can sign. But the question you have to ask yourself is, even if your state says, yes, a child can sign, maybe it says a child over 16 can sign, can that child actually give informed consent? Now, remember, we said informed consent means they understand and appreciate the nature of what they're agreeing to. Does a child really understand and appreciate their video being on social media? That's, again, a blurry line and a hard call. So best practices are to have the parent sign. And so what additional information do you need on this form when a parent is signing? Kind of like what I just talked about when you have an estate signing, is some sort of certification that they're attesting, I am the parent or guardian, I have the ability to do this. Again, that way, let's say say they're divorced, right? The other parent comes like, no, they couldn't be. No, they signed, they gave me that certification. You've now reduced your risk because they've signed saying they are. That's between them now.
Yeah.
So having that, but still the same language of what are they consenting to? How is it being shared? All of that stuff. And the other thing, and we touched on this in the prior panel, and I think it's really important, is even if the parent is signing, but the body language of the child or other things are indicating to you the child isn't comfortable with this, you really have to take a pause and say, should I be sharing that? If the child is indicating, then you really should be listening to that and deciding, is it worth it to, or is it too risky to share this story? Because children can be re-traumatized, right?
Mm.
It's having that out there permanently. Anything we put out there in the world is permanent nowadays. So if a child seems uneasy about that, and that goes again for really anybody, if they're signing the consent, but their body language and what they're telling you is really showing you they don't want to do this or they're not sure, then pause. And this, a lot of times, it's a process, right? Don't ask them to sign right away. Ask them to think about it. It maybe you come back to it in a month, right? That they can understand. They can maybe take some time to see how you've shared other stories and what's been done with that. You don't want to rush them into this process.
I think that's such a good point that you just said. Maybe if you had some examples that would really, especially for maybe a child, can help illustrate what their story would look like and what that might be, what the final product might look like. And then of course, before you publish your final product, let's check back in again and make sure everybody's okay with how they're being represented.
Right.
Another really important part of the process.
And I think that review piece, if the person,
Yeah.
right, but making sure that's in the agreement. If they're going to have the right to review, put that in there. One, it assures them, hey, I signed this and I know they're going to let me review it because it's in there. It gives them that extra assurance and protection that they need.
So let's talk a little bit more about this. Here is a question that came in from Cecilia. So this is a kind of a specific example, but I think really relevant to a lot of people I'm seeing in the chat. So she said, I work for a nonprofit who helps children with cancer. Some parents are avid about posting everything and anything about their child's cancer. Sometimes they even tag our organization. Is it okay to share that on our public page? What are a nonprofit's experience? What other nonprofits have you seen, or what are their experiences with sharing other posts on their social media accounts? This is like the most, I mean, this is a great question.
And I love it because every organization at some point has dealt with this, because we love, right? We love when we get tagged. We love when we can share. It's our community. It's sharing the stories directly from them. But here's where consent not being one size fits all comes into play. So someone tags you in their story. Now they tagged you, so right, I guess that means I've got consent to share it publicly, but do you really know that? Maybe they were just tagging you because they wanted their family to know about the hospital where their child is getting care, and so maybe they'll donate, or whatever your organization is. You really don't know. But are you going to go and send them your consent form to do that? No, right? Practically no. So what I recommend, best practices are, reach out on that platform asking, is it okay if we share your story on our public page? Make sure they know that public piece, because maybe their page is private, or even if it's public, it doesn't have the reach you have.
Good point.
So to make sure you're putting that in there, can we share that publicly? If you're going to use a story on your feed, I think then you want to get the actual written consent, right? That has that permanency. You have more time. The story disappears 24 hours, so you do need to act quickly. So it's that balance between consent while still, working within the confines of needing to get it out quickly.
So this, okay, you've got me thinking about something that happens a lot here, which is a lot of nonprofits, if they don't, let's say they don't use, MemoryFox, okay? Let's say, the crazy people that don't use MemoryFox. No, just kidding. But they'll say something like, oh, tag us in, or hashtag our organization, and then I'll see the photos from your event. If somebody just hashtags my organization, let's not even say tag, right? They maybe hashtag the event I was at. Can I, as a nonprofit, use that photo?
So I think there's two answers. The first is, sometimes when we have an event and if we're hosting, you might sign some sort of form or participant form. I think that's a great place in there to have that in there, that if you share using this or you tag us, that's consent to share, putting that in there. But what if it's not? I think in that case, again, better safe than sorry. And it's one of those where 99.99% of times it's not going to be an issue. But that one time it is, right? Do you really want that? And so if it's as simple as, even with the hashtag, hey, can we share? But if you're doing something where you're putting out a hashtag or you're having some sort of event or something and people are coming, have that as part of, you know, the participant, what they're signing.
Right, as part of registration or as part of
Exactly.
when they sign in at the event, something like that. That's such a good point. I love
100%.
that. You see that a lot actually now. So
Right. And you know what it is? It's right now it's adapting these archaic legal concept and rules to these modern technologies. And unfortunately, there isn't always a perfect answer, right? And it's having to balance the legal with the practical. And I think that's that balance of there.
wow. Yes. Okay. You've really got me thinking a lot about stuff that I haven't considered before, because I've definitely been on a social media team and just thought, I'll just share some, like, what could go wrong, but
And you're not the only one. It is right. I think a lot of people on this course think, I have done that because, like I said, they tag me. They must want to. Like when my friend tags me, I do it. But I know my friend. Maybe that's different. But even so, maybe now I should go ask my friend if I should, you know, reshare. It's this idea of what are people actually consenting to, and you don't really know, and you want to know. You need to know.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm really glad that we have talked about that, because I bet that's got some people, little food for
Yeah.
thought, as we consider as we go forward, right? With social media, it's not going anywhere.
Yep.
All right, let's talk about, okay, so this is a great question that is similar. So this is kind of just about staff stories in particular. So this came from Hollis. Hollis said, if staff are featured in stories, videos, or photos, should we be getting signed consent from them as well?
Yes, yes, yes. And yes again. You should be getting consent from anyone whose story, photo you're sharing, volunteers, program participants, staff, you name it. I'll go back to the example of their photo is shared on your Facebook from something, and their abusive ex didn't know where they worked, and now they do, right? Just because they're showing up to work does not mean that you have consent to put them out there. So you need to be getting consent. And again, you can use similar type of template, right? And that's, are you using it for Facebook? Are you using it? But also too, even like sometimes I roll up to work looking a hot mess. I don't want that picture out there,
Yeah.
right? So it's not even just like situations like that, but also just like, I don't really want people seeing what I look like today. Those type of situations. So, but also being upfront with your staff and having conversations about, okay, what will it be used for? Please let us know. And I think this goes in general, right? You may have people, like, let's say you have an event that don't want to be photographed. What do you do, right? How do you manage that? So I've seen organizations name tags. There might be like a little dot or something that just, so even when the photographer is going through the pictures, they at least know. So you can find creative ways if you have a big group to figure out to know that. So you don't run afoul.
Right. Oh, that's such a nice little event hack right there. You just dropped like a great, yeah, that's fairly easy if you're having name tags. It's could be sort of simple just to look through the registration form, see if anybody did not consent to be in photos or videos, and let's not take photos or videos of them. I mean,
Exactly.
yeah, that sounds
Right.
great.
It's really just this, right? Giving people autonomy over themselves. We hear this all the time with athletes and college professionals, name, image, likeness. We
Yeah.
all have that too, right? And so we want people to have control of that. And so you're giving them that ability with this.
Yes, I would love to be getting paid that
Right.
NIL money, just if you guys are going to use my photo or video after this, I'll tell you where to send the check.
Yeah.
No, I think that is a really good point. Yeah, we definitely don't want to, just because they are on staff, we don't want to make assumptions. We do want to continue to ask, and we want to, especially, as again, I'm somebody who's been on a social media teams many times, and I'm always, trying to catch a video of this thing in action, or this, day in the life sort of situation. But let's make sure people are really okay with being posted.
100%.
Okay, we're making great time. We are hitting all of our questions. I love this. This question, okay, this is about consent maintenance. Okay, so this came from LK. She asked this during the September panel. So this question was, how do you maintain consent from participants who may not be easily able to contact again?
Yeah. So that is such a good one and such a common one because a lot of times, right, it may just be from an event or things like that. So you have to go back to what did they actually consent to? If they consented to it being shared irrevocably in this way or in that way, fine. But if you're now going to be using it in a different way, or say you put a time frame on it in your agreement, you can't do it unless you can get in contact with them. It still maintains their story. So I know it can be hard, but if you plan or you're thinking, hey, we might use this in a different way, try to get some sort of consent. I mean, some sort of contact information. But if you don't, then you can't use it except for in the confines of what they consented to.
Wow.
Right. And it's hard because you want to, and usually you realize it after the fact.
Yes.
So it's why it's important to be thinking about these things. Right. That's a risk, right? Right there, you've identified a risk that we want to use this in another way and we can't contact the participant. So what can we do proactively against that? It's important to have a management system to monitor your consents, right? And whether that includes contact information, if you set timeframes on your consent, have some sort of monitoring of when they expire. So you can be, right? There is administrative work, but it reduces your risk.
That's such a good point. And you were also hitting on the that consent can expire. Like if you have an expiration date, I feel like um it's a good idea to have some sort of sunsetting on stories or just rechecking in, right? Just making sure that people still are okay with how a story is being conveyed, or maybe sharing it if it's okay, even share it in the same place if it's been a certain amount of time. This is a good practice.
Right. More check-ins is never a problem, right? This is a process. These are things that you want to be overly cautious about because there are really high risks involved.
Okay, well, we have some questions from the chat.
Right.
All right, let me see what this one says. It looks like it came from Jane, and Jane said, when using event photos, does it have to be signed consent, a signed consent form, or can it also be noticed that we may use the photos and the individual did not check the opt-out box? Oh, that's a good question.
So it's going to depend on the language, right? Because, and this is where you want to then have language that says if you do not check the opt-out box, right, then it does. So it's like, it really is going to depend on the language and you have to be overly cautious. So thinking in terms of event, the safest bet is to only do people that have opted in.
Right.
Right? Now, if you include that form with all of the others that they're already signing and they've checked off other stuff, then you're assuming they did read it.
Right.
And so by not opting out, they really opt in, right? Like it's a lot of mental gymnastics. So all of that to say, I think you got to have the opt-in. It's better safe than sorry. I would only do it if you had the opt-in. I wouldn't risk otherwise.
I tend to agree with that as well. That is a tough one, but yes.
But I think this is a great example is a lot of times it comes down to what is written in there and how you write it. But it's always better to have like affirmative consent because that's what informed consent is, right? You know that they actually agreed to it.
So you reminded me of another question that came in during registration. So I pulled it up because I need to know. This question is about informed consent, and it came from Jonna. And Jonna said, do cultural or language issues ever come into play? We have a lot of Latino neighbors and many only speak Spanish.
Your form needs to be in Spanish. The person talking to them needs to be talking to them in Spanish. So all of that comes into play, right? We talk about accessible. What you're giving these people needs to be accessible, and that may look different to different people. So it needs to be at a reading level that they can comprehend. So you need to think about the general population that you're serving is, would the majority of people be able to understand that? And if that means that it needs to be in a different language, needs to be translated, it also means the person who is discussing it with them needs to be in that language, because they're not going to necessarily, even if they speak fluently, there are certain concepts, right, that it just, there's a difference. And if that's their preferred language, even if they speak and understand English, for it to truly be informed, having it in their native language is the preferred and what you should be doing.
So this, as a personal anecdote, we have been coming across some of our storytellers who have similar questions to this, but they have been recording their consents and then having people listen to them. What do you think about something like that, like providing consent in an audio way? Because the way our platform works is through your phone or through your desktop. So there wouldn't, let's say there isn't a human available.
I think as long as they're providing consent and it's clear what they're providing consent to, so that, so I guess my question back is, what are they responding to when they're saying they consent?
Okay, so the example would be it is a written consent form, but then somebody like me recorded it. So I said the exact same consent form in video. So they had the option to read or listen.
I think that's 100% fine, because that's being accessible. It
Okay.
is meeting the needs of that participant. And as long as, again, you still have some sort of memorialization of it, that's what we're concerned with. Because also, what if you have a participant who is deaf, blind, like all these different things, you need to meet them where they're at and provide it in a form that, one, fits the technology you're working with, but also makes it accessible to them. So that is absolutely fine.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. We are seeing more and more people ask us about like video consents or audio consents. So that's interesting. So yeah, we'll just continue to say that let's do both, and let's make sure that, especially if you have the ability to record it yourself, let's do that. That sounds
Right.
great.
As long as you're saving them, then that's good.
Okay. So I've got another question here from Kalia. And Kalia said, okay, so we talked a little bit about this, but let's expand. So this is about consent for multiple uses. So this question says, how should I manage consent if they've approved a quote for our college channels, but I also want to use it for fundraising? So maybe something internal, and then, oh, but now I really like this story, so can I use it? How should I manage something like that?
Well, and that's why I say is you can have this template that has the different uses and ways. And if you at the outset know you plan to use it for both, you can have multiple purposes in one consent. As
Okay.
it doesn't have to be a consent for each purpose. So if you know at the outset, we want to use it this, this, and this, or we think we may, get the consent for that at the beginning. If you realize, wow, this was so successful here, we want to use it in this other way, then just resend the form with the new box checked that you want to use it in an additional way.
Yeah, I think that makes so much sense. And I hope that I hope Kalia finds that helpful. And I think, yeah, sometimes we come into these situations where we're maybe collecting feedback from something, like an event, like somebody tells you how much they enjoyed your event, and then you're like, oh, well, can I record that and have you actually, tell me that? And
Yeah.
you would still want to go through a full like consent talk about that.
And I think too, there's ways, again, to work with technology. So like, right, you have your phones, you have your tablets at events, and to have forms on there that, if it is more substantial stories that you want to make sure you're getting written consents, people can sign right. We have all this technology at our disposal. Use it.
I think, hey, I couldn't be a bigger proponent for technology. I am, I'm fully on board with that. Okay, well, with that, I think that we are just about ready to wrap up. So, Allie, just as an overall, what, maybe like an overall wrap up, I know you hit on so many good things today, so I don't know if I even want to say one key takeaway, but is there maybe one last piece of advice that maybe you didn't get to that you would love for our audience to hear today?
I think the piece of advice I would say is, don't be put off by this. Don't be scared, right? Like I said, risk is inherent in everything, but we can't let it stop us from doing this work, the storytelling work, the work that shows the impact your organizations are having. So that is the advice, is not to let it scare you off or stop you from doing the amazing things you're doing.
I am really actually so glad that you said that because yeah, I think this conversation has felt so important, so informative, maybe a little heavy, but at the same time, we're having important conversations because we need to, and we can't just always do things the way we've always done them.
And
And
that's the other thing I hear a lot, but we've always done it this way. But
I
that,
bet you hear that even more than I do.
yeah, I hear it a lot. Too much.
Thank you. I bet, yeah, you hear it all the time. Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. There we go. Oh, good. I think, yes, let Allie know how much we appreciate her in the chat. Let her know that we have had the best time. I know I have certainly learned a lot. My dog's barking now because she is like applauding you in the way that she knows how. But anyway, I think that we will definitely host another one of these. I think we could even ask the same questions again, and some answers would be different in a year, right? I mean, that you never know.
Well, and I think too is people see like when we like certain specific examples, like the tagging and sharing. If you have those, send them to us because we want to make sure what we're answering fits what you need. So either continue to put questions in the chat or send them to Carly so we make sure we get those, or whatever article we do next that we're answering what you want to know.
Yes, and definitely follow Allie on LinkedIn.
Yes.
And yeah, just a final thank you from me. I'm so grateful that you have taken the time to come back and answer my questions, my personal questions, as well as the questions that I'm here representing our community. So thank you so much. And now, if anybody wants to stick around and hear a little bit about MemoryFox, I'd love to just share a few slides with you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, but of course, give me just a minute because it always takes me just a minute to figure out exactly which screen I'm doing everything on. You know, it is 2024, but at the same time, you know, we're still learning around here, right? All right, so I'm going to share my screen over here. And I want to make sure I share my sound. All right, wonderful. Okay, so, all right, wonderful. Now you can see my screen. This is great. So we had a great talk about ethical storytelling. We had a great talk about consent. You know, taking maybe one step backwards and thinking about stories in general and nonprofit stories in general, I always love to start off with this question, which would be, if somebody asks, what is your mission? Can you show them? And I think, you know, I like to ask this because we all have practiced saying our mission several times. So I bet you could convey it through words. You could probably recite exactly what's on your website like the back of your hand. But do you have the photos, videos, testimonials to really show your mission? And if you find yourself saying no, then I ask you, what is stopping you? And the thing is, when we talk to nonprofits, we find that they really have four main pain points. Number one, collecting content from my community is like pulling teeth. Two, organizing content is frustrating and very time consuming. Three, we need a more efficient and modern way to share our story. Or four, I struggle with collecting community stories ethically. So here we are at MemoryFox. We actually came up with a technology solution that kind of directly addresses all four of those pain points. So we have a three-step process. It's collect, organize, and share. I'm going to go through a quick overview of each step today, but if you really want to learn more, I highly recommend you book a time with one of our storytellers. The main thing I want to point out is that I totally recognize that nonprofits have been given this impossible task of competing in the attention economy while also remaining true to ethical standards for authenticity and storytelling. So that's what we were talking about today, right? You are up against big brands with big money that are trying to outmarket you with their stories. But guess what? You have real stories at your fingertips. So what I want to share with you is just one stat that we learned from last year's ethical storytelling report, which is that 58% of people like you said that they struggle with wanting to collect stories from their community while doing no harm. So you might be feeling that way. You might be in that 58%. But just so you know, there's a lot of people like you. So please don't feel like you're doing anything wrong. but you are really up against these big ethical standards. So let's talk about our process. So the first thing about MemoryFox is we help you collect stories. So with MemoryFox, you are able to generate a campaign that is branded and you send it directly to the person you want to collect the story from. If you want to see how it works, you can scan that QR code and actually submit a cute pet photo or a nice, maybe a photo of nature. But go ahead and scan that and you can see how it works for yourself. But really the cool thing about the way we help you collect stories is that you send a link directly to the person you want to get the story from, and then they can submit a photo, video, or written testimonial. There's no download or login required. We do capture consent info up front, and we do help you manage consent. So that does include consent removal. And at the end of their submission, it'll direct right back to your website. So you can have your donation page there, whatever you want people to see next. In terms of organizing your submissions, when somebody submits a video, photo, or written testimonial to you, they actually are going to automatically populate into your story bank, which is your story bank. It's all just for your nonprofit, just for the people who you work with to go manage all of your stories. So when you're in your story bank, you can tag your content by things that are important to you. That might be your program, maybe it's by event, maybe it's by department, maybe it's by the way you plan to use it. Allie talked about billboards. Allie talked about annual reports. She talked about social media. Maybe how you use it might be the way that you want to organize it. One great thing about our story bank is you can also bulk upload any existing content you have, so it can all be in one place. And we have unlimited storage, so it doesn't matter if you collect one story, although we would really like you to collect more than one story, of course, but if you do collect thousands and thousands of stories, that's fine, unlimited storage. And then in terms of sharing, we then have a bunch of tools in place that help you turn your most compelling content into really great social media posts, collateral, things that you actually are going to be able to share. So we do that in a few ways. We have a video editor where you can combine and edit your clips. We do have a story builder page, so you can make a web page of several stories in one place. One thing about sharing is you can always download the high quality original. So whatever your storyteller shared with you, you are able to download in whatever form that came in. And finally, you can see from this really nice GIF that we are integrated with Canva. So when someone submits a photo or video to you, it's actually going to automatically go to your Canva account. And I know for me, that saves me a lot of time. And in terms of ethical storytelling features, we have a lot of features that really promote ethical storytelling. So number one is that we have an equitable pricing model. So that means that the price depends on how your nonprofit is built, how big your nonprofit is, the amount of help that you have at your nonprofit. And that is really because we believe every nonprofit does have great stories to tell. So we want to help find a way for you to do that. We talked a lot about consent today. One thing about MemoryFox is we have built-in consent. So you're able to edit your consent to say all that language that you need from your state, from your region, just like Allie was talking about. And like I mentioned, we also have a consent removal option. So if somebody submits a story that they no longer want shared, we help you facilitate that as well. In terms of privacy, when stories get submitted to your account, MemoryFox never owns those stories. Those are all your property. In terms of accessibility, MemoryFox is available on mobile device, it's on tablets, you can access it on your desktop. So it's really so your storyteller can be comfortable sharing when and where they are comfortable. And finally, everything about it is customizable, which really is a great way where you can implement your strength-based language that is going to be the way that you prefer to speak with your community and speak about your community. So, like I said, it was just going to be a little quick demo to explain just kind of an overall of what MemoryFox is, but I would love it if you really want to learn more. Definitely consider scanning this QR code, head to our demo page, and connect with one of our MemoryFox storytellers because we are all about ethical storytelling. We would love to answer your questions, your unique ethical storytelling questions, and we would really love for you to start collecting great stories with us today. So with that, I should stop sharing my screen. Looks like we have some really great stuff happening here in the chat. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you all for sticking around. You'll all get this recording from me, in just a few minutes once I get it uploaded. And thank you again to Allie, who was just a wonderful resource for us today. I will see you next time.